This is Larry Connors USA. Larry Connors USA.
We're looking for a guilty verdict. We're looking for a guilty verdict, and we're looking to see if all of the talk that took place and has been taking place after they saw what happened to George Floyd, if nothing does not happen, then we know that we've got to not only stay in the street, but we've got to fight for justice. But I am very hopeful, and I hope that we're going to get a verdict that will say guilty, guilty, guilty.
The words of Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Democrat of California in Minnesota. Talking about the trial, where now the jury is considering instructions, or will be shortly considering instructions from the judge as to what charges they should consider against Derrick Chauvin for the death of May 2020 for George Floyd. Congresswoman Waters in the street, past a 7 o'clock curfew, by the way, that is put in place for that state to keep violence from happening by the Democrat governor. And she's out there saying we have to have a guilty verdict. There may be some case that either you were directly involved in or something you watched from afar that you thought that they should come back with this ruling, regardless of what you were thinking, guilty or innocent. But it was your belief that's what it should be. And the ruling that came back did not fit with what your thoughts were. What do you do in a case like that? Some people take to the streets. And some people just shake their head and say, I don't think justice was done, but move on. We understand what's in play on the streets right now in this case involving particularly the Derrick Chauvin case, and also in Brooklyn Center, the death of Daunte Wright, shot by a 26-year vet of the Brooklyn City Police Department when she pulled out her pistol and shot instead of shooting her taser, which she claimed she was getting ready to fire. But this kind of language from a representative of Congress, that's the question. That's the issue. And she's not the only one to do it. But, I mean, if she's out there doing that, not only violating the curfew, but saying we must have a guilty verdict. I'm going to let you hear in more detail in a moment. But she's saying that is only what we're going to take. And it's got to be a murder verdict. Can't be one of the lesser charges of guilty. And you also had Congresswoman Rashida Tliab, Democrat of Michigan, that basically has declared that the death of Daunte Wright wasn't an accident. She said policing in our country is inherently and intentionally racist. Daunte Wright was met with aggression and violence. She said, I'm done with those who condone government-funded murder. No more policing, incarceration, and militarization. It can't be reformed. And again, she's talking about the Daunte Wright case that took place about 10 miles from where the jury is now sitting and getting ready to gather and caucus for a verdict on the George Floyd case. When you have folks who have such a strong view one way or the other, you shouldn't automatically just dismiss them. But the same token, I think it's important that we keep things in perspective. If this situation were turned entirely around, and of course some would say, well, it never will be, Larry, that's what the issue is. What are you willing to accept that if you think it would be right in your view to have the same attitude that you want a guilty verdict, and if you don't get a guilty verdict, then there's going to be hell to pay, one way or the other? Are we going to have law and order or are we not? Former GOP House Chairman, Congressional Chair, Speaker, Newt Gingrich on that point.
I don't think it's racist for a black small business owner to not want their small business burned down. I think this whole absurdity that as a civilization, you either provide safety or you dissolve. And we've had both with Rashida Tliab, who called for abolishing the police and eliminating prisons, which is a position of utter insanity. And now, of course, you have Waters, who has always been on the left. But what's happened with every passing, the more patient we are, the more radical they are.
Do you buy that argument from Gingrich? Well, of course, their argument in return could be, yeah, but if we don't get radical, you continue to sit there, you're doing nothing. Well, what is to be done? What is to be done, and to what level? When Congresswoman Tliab the other day, as I was saying a moment ago, saying that no more policing, no more incarceration, how's that supposed to work? Every time we talk about defunding police, and when those funds are pulled, which community gets hurt the worst? The very ones that are saying they're not getting justice as it is. There's no doubt in most minority communities who's to blame for crime in their area. They know darn well who it is. And they may or may not speak because, one, they've been cautioned and warned, snitches get stitches, and or maybe it's relatives of theirs, or they just don't get me involved. Just leave me alone. I'm just going to try to make my way through. And yet, how many times do we have innocent children being caught in crossfire, as happened in Chicago with this last weekend? I'll get in more detail of that again here shortly. It is understandable for anyone who believes that I don't think our message is getting through, but going into the streets, using your First Amendment right, that's acceptable. But then when you begin to throw, loot, burn, attack, you've exceeded your First Amendment protections. And in fact, when a congresswoman stands out there and makes that remark, the question has to be again, are you doing any good for the community as a whole? And more importantly, should you be guilty if there's any problem that follows you? Follows your remarks. Listen again to the remarks of Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
Guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away.
And not just manslaughter, right? I mean...
Oh, no, not manslaughter. No. This is guilty for murder. I don't know whether it's in the first degree, but as far as I'm concerned, it's first degree murder.
Congresswoman, what happens if we do not get what you just told? What should the people do? What should protesters on the street do?
I didn't hear you.
What happens? What should protesters do?
Well, we got to stay on the street, and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we need business.
So does that sound like it's inciting violence if the verdict doesn't come back in the way that she insists it must be done? And how does that fit with our law and order court justice system anyway? I don't care who you are, what your color is, what your background is, what the legal, whatever the issue is in front of a jury. If you think in the street you could tell the jury what to do and they should be following, or there be threats against them and or their community, you're not only out of line, you are guilty of possibly inciting more violence if it follows. And we do know that shortly after she made those statements, shortly after she did that, there were, as I pointed out in using commentary a moment ago, someone driving by firing several shots at members of the National Guard that were on duty in the area. None of the members seriously hurt, we're told. But still, it could have been. That is all part of the Minneapolis Police Department, along with the County Sheriff's Office, State of Minnesota, and the National Guard all coming together in what they call Operation Safety Net for Minneapolis, preparing for what could happen after this verdict, and also what's been happening since the Brooklyn Center shooting involving Officer Kim Potter and the death of Daunte Wright. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican of Georgia, is pushing forward with an effort to expel Congresswoman Maxine Waters from Congress for her remarks. The statement from Greene's office says the resolution would be to expel Congresswoman Maxine Waters for her continued incitement of violence. The reaction from Waters is that basically she's saying what needs to be said. And even as real-time host Bill Maher, one of the darlings of the left, said that those kinds of statements, the same with Rashida Tliab, Democrat of Michigan, all leading up to no more policing. He said, what are we supposed to do? Let the criminals be on honor roll? Do you think they're going to follow that? Do you really think so? Even if you support what Maxine Waters has said and you think that, yeah, maybe we need to have more demonstrations or something of that nature, as long as they're peaceful under First Amendment rights, you can certainly do so. But otherwise, you have violence. When you have violence, things get out of control, and then, yes, we end up having more hurt. Innocents in some cases. So back to the former Speaker of the House remarks, Newt Gingrich, and his belief that right now we need to stand for law and order.
The more patient we are, the more radical they are. So you have over a year of violence in Portland, Oregon. You have an expectation of violence. Why should we expect violence if the criminal justice system works? Why should we tolerate violence? Why should we tolerate National Guardsmen being shot at? I think we have to really rethink our whole approach to making sure that we stop people from being violent, if necessary, by doing the opposite of what Rashida Tliab wanted and actually increasing the prisons. But you cannot have a country which cowers in fear and which has radicals who wander around openly encouraging violence.
Can you find any point to disagree with that we want a country that cowers every time there's something like this going on and we don't send in police to stop it? If it's in your neighborhood involving your family, your relatives, does your view change? Which brings to the forefront something we're going to discuss before we wrap up this hour. Remarks by CNN Chris Cuomo, basically stating all the shootings in the street, he's specifically referring to black Americans being shot by police officers. He said that will not stop, will not cease until the white kids are the ones being shot by police. And he cites some cases that either he doesn't have the facts or he's ignoring them, which wouldn't surprise me. For instance, they're bringing up this 13-year-old shot the other day, and they're all saying he didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a weapon. Well, the video does show, before it got edited, that he had a weapon in his hand, and he had been running from, apparently with another group, police identifying a gang group, opening fire on various people. Whether or not the other gang members, it wasn't clear. But when they catch up to him, the officer's telling him to show he knows he's got a gun, he sees it, and then he releases it, falling back behind a fence at the same time the officer shoots. The officer made a split-second decision. He's going to be questioned about it. They're going to take a full inquiry. But, of course, at that moment, he did not have the weapon in his hand. And so that is, again, adding fuel to the fire that police are just going to shoot to kill, especially if they're young blacks. Would they do it if it's a young white child? We'll get into that in more detail before we wrap up. But before that, I want to tell you about the police chief. The police chief, he says, we have to have policing, and these Congress people need to shut up.
You can connect with Larry on Twitter @LarryConnorsUSA.